The Marines knew something was wrong the moment their landing craft scraped against the shoreline of the tiny Pacific island. It wasn't on most maps, and the few who had heard of it described it only as a speck of jungle surrounded by reefs. Yet orders were orders. Secure the ridge, observe enemy movement, and hold until relieved. No one expected relief to come quickly. From the first step onto the beach, the place felt abandoned by everything except the war itself. The trees were twisted, vines hung low like traps, and the humid air wrapped around the Marines as if refusing to let them go. Their boots sank into the soaked ground with every move. Even the birds were silent, almost as if nature didn't want to draw attention to anything living on the island. The radio operator set up his gear within the first hour, but the moment he tried reaching command, only static answered. He tried again, and again. Nothing. The lieutenant frowned, but he didn't let it show. The men were already tired from the boat ride, and the storm clouds gathering above didn't help. Still, he gave the same steady order every Marine had heard 100 times. We hold the ridge, no matter what. Reaching the ridge took most of the afternoon. The path was narrow, muddy, and cut only by old Japanese trenches overgrown with roots. Signs of previous fighting lay everywhere. Rusted helmets, rotted ammo boxes, abandoned foxholes. It was clear that someone had bled for this hill long before the Americans arrived. The thought settled heavily in their minds. By nightfall, the storm hit. Rain hammered the jungle like artillery. Their ponchos were useless, turning into cold, wet skins clinging to their backs. The wind howled across the ridge, drowning out everything but the occasional crack of branches snapping in the darkness. The lieutenant checked the perimeter twice. Nothing moved, but the unease in his gut wouldn't fade. He had fought long enough to know when the silence meant trouble. Still, he forced his voice to stay calm. Keep your eyes open. This place isn't empty. On the second night, Corporal Hayes spotted something. Just a flicker of movement beyond the tree line. A shadow where no shadow should be. He raised his rifle, but the darkness swallowed everything again. When he reported it, the lieutenant simply nodded. They were being watched, maybe hunted. By the third night, the men were exhausted, soaked, and hungry. Supplies were running low. The radio remained dead. The ridge, supposedly easy to defend, felt like a trap with no exits. And then came the unmistakable sound cutting through the storm. A single metallic click, like a rifle bolt being slowly pulled back somewhere in the jungle below. The lieutenant froze. The men around him tensed. Every Marine knew that sound, and every man understood its meaning. The enemy was close. They weren't alone. And on this forgotten island, far from reinforcements, far from command, far from help, the mission they'd been sent on had just turned into a fight for survival. The storm roared. The jungle shifted. And the night, deep, black, endless, waited for what would come next. Midnight came without warning on the forgotten island. One moment the ridge was wrapped in heavy silence, broken only by dripping rain and the slow breathing of exhausted Marines. The next moment, without footsteps, without whispers, without even the snap of a branch, the night exploded. It started with a flare. A single, blinding burst of white light shot into the sky, turning the jungle into a twisting world of shadows and sharp edges. The Marines blinked, stunned, but the lieutenant didn't need more than a heartbeat to understand. They're coming. Positions. The first shots cracked before the echo of his voice faded. Japanese rifles opened fire from below the ridge, dozens of muzzles flashing in the darkness. Machine gun bursts ripped through branches, dirt, and the flimsy cover the Marines had built. The air filled with the snapping hiss of bullets passing inches from faces. The men dropped into firing positions, returning fire as fast as they could. But the jungle played tricks. Shadows moved unpredictably. Figures vanished between roots and rocks. The Japanese used the terrain like ghosts, advancing in short, silent bursts, appearing only long enough to fire before melting back into darkness. Then came the shouts. Deep, sharp cries in Japanese, rolling through the trees like a wave. It wasn't random, it was coordinated, controlled, and terrifyingly close. The ridge, narrow and steep, suddenly felt like a funnel with the Marines at the top and a rising tide of attackers pushing upward. Left flank. They're hitting the left flank, Hayes shouted. The lieutenant sprinted over, rain splashing under his boots. He saw them, dark shapes climbing fast, bayonets glinting in the fading flare light. He fired, dropping one, then another, but more kept coming. The enemy moved with a strange, relentless determination, as if the storm, the mud, and the bullets meant nothing to them. A grenade landed near the foxhole. Hayes reacted instantly, kicking it downhill. It exploded mid-air, shaking the ridge and sending fragments buzzing through leaves. "Hold the line!" the lieutenant yelled, though his voice was nearly drowned by the chaos. But the Japanese were already breaking through. A group pushed up the center using a fallen tree as cover. 2 Marines guarding that sector were overwhelmed within seconds, forced back by sudden close-quarters combat. The clash of steel rang out, bayonets against helmets, knives against rifle stocks. The screams tore into the night. The lieutenant rushed toward them but was forced down by a burst of machine gun fire that shredded the sandbags in front of him. Dirt hit his face. His ears rang. And through the ringing he heard something worse. The sound of boots stomping up the ridge behind broken positions. The line was cracking, piece by piece, minute by minute. Another flare lit the sky. Midnight came without warning on the forgotten island. One moment the ridge was wrapped in heavy silence, broken only by dripping rain and the slow breathing of exhausted Marines. The next moment, without footsteps, without whispers, without even the snap of a branch, the night exploded. It started with a flare. A single, blinding burst of white light shot into the sky, turning the jungle into a twisting world of shadows and sharp edges. The Marines blinked, stunned, but the lieutenant didn't need more than a heartbeat to understand. "They're coming. Positions." The first shots cracked before the echo of his voice faded. Japanese rifles opened fire from below the ridge, dozens of muzzles flashing in the darkness. Machine gun bursts ripped through branches, dirt, and the flimsy cover the Marines had built. The air filled with the snapping hiss of bullets passing inches from faces. The men dropped into firing positions, returning fire as fast as they could. But the jungle played tricks. Shadows moved unpredictably. When the ridge finally fell silent for a moment, the lieutenant realized something horrifying. The Marines he had pulled back were either dead, wounded, or scattered somewhere in the chaos. Smoke drifted through the trees. Bodies, friend and foe, lay half-hidden in the mud. And for the first time, he felt the weight of a truth he'd never imagined facing. He was alone. Somewhere below, Japanese soldiers regrouped, their shadows moving like dark waves preparing for another assault. The lieutenant wiped blood, some his, some not, from his face and forced himself upright. He checked his rifle. Half a magazine left, 2 grenades, a knife, and a ridge barely wide enough for 2 men to stand shoulder to shoulder. But he stood alone. The night wind carried faint voices, Japanese officers shouting orders, boots splashing through mud, metal clicking as weapons were reloaded. The lieutenant knew what was coming. They had broken the line, crushed every defense, and now they wanted the ridge completely. They believed the remaining resistance would be nothing more than a formality. He would prove them wrong. He positioned himself behind a fallen tree, the closest thing to cover left. From here, he had a narrow angle down both sides of the ridge. Not ideal, not even good, but it was enough for one man determined not to die quietly. The first attackers appeared as silhouettes, moving low, confident, unaware they were facing a lone Marine. The lieutenant fired 3 shots, clean, controlled. 3 bodies dropped before they could even shout. More figures froze, confused, unsure of how many Americans remained. That hesitation bought him seconds. Seconds he desperately needed. He shifted positions, sliding to another patch of darkness so the enemy couldn't track his fire. A burst of machine gun rounds tore through where he'd been seconds earlier. Bark exploded. Dirt sprayed across his face. But he stayed focused. One ridge, one man, one line the enemy couldn't cross. A group tried to flank him on the right, creeping through thick brush. The lieutenant pulled a grenade, yanked the pin with his teeth, and rolled it downhill. The explosion shook the ridge, sending shrapnel and screams into the blackness. But the Japanese kept coming. Closer, faster, more determined. A soldier lunged out of the shadows, bayonet aimed at his chest. The lieutenant fired point-blank, the flash lighting their faces for an instant. The attacker fell at his feet, but another jumped over the body, swinging a rifle like a club. The lieutenant blocked with his own weapon, steel crashing against wood. Pain shot up his arm, but he drove a knee into the attacker's stomach, sent him stumbling, then finished him with a single shot. The ridge went quiet again, only for seconds, but long enough for the lieutenant to hear his own heartbeat. He checked his ammunition. A few rounds. A single grenade. No backup coming, at least not yet. The Japanese were regrouping again, and when they returned, it would be with numbers impossible for any man to face. But he wasn't thinking about numbers. He was thinking about survival, honor, duty, and holding this ridge for as long as a single Marine could breathe. He moved to a higher rock formation, the last defensible point. Smoke curled around him, his breath fogged in the cold midnight air. Down below, dozens of silhouettes formed. Silent this time, no battle cries, no rushing charge. They were coming cautiously now, realizing someone up there wasn't breaking. The lieutenant raised his rifle. One ridge, he whispered to himself. They're not taking it. And when the Japanese surged forward again, dozens against one, he opened fire. The battle that followed should have been impossible. One man against an entire assault force. But impossibility didn't matter on that ridge. Not that night, because one Marine refused to let them pass. When the first pale light of dawn crept across the ridge, it revealed a scene that none of the Marines who returned would ever forget. The jungle, which only hours earlier had been alive with gunfire, screams, and the pounding of boots, now lay in a heavy, unnatural silence. Smoke hung low, drifting in thin ribbons through the shattered trees. The night's violence had left scars everywhere. Splintered trunks, burned brush, and dark pools of mud that hid what was beneath them. But the ridge itself, that was something else entirely. As the Marines climbed back toward the position they had been forced to abandon in the chaos of the night, they moved cautiously, expecting another ambush, another charge, another wave of enemy fire. Instead, they found stillness. No movement. No sound except the crackle of dying flames and the distant murmur of returning daylight insects. And then they saw him. Their lieutenant was sitting with his back against a rock, his rifle across his lap, head lowered as if he were simply resting. For a moment, the men thought he might just look up, greet them with one of his calm, steady lines. But as they came closer, they saw the truth. He had finally collapsed from exhaustion, blood loss, and the sheer brutality of what he had endured. Yet his hand was still wrapped around his weapon, finger resting near the trigger. Even in unconsciousness, he hadn't let go of the fight. Around him lay the evidence of what had happened during those impossible hours. Dozens of bodies, Japanese soldiers who had fallen in small clusters, scattered across the ridge like jagged pieces of a broken wave. The Marines exchanged stunned looks. They had expected a massacre, but not like this. Not one man holding back an entire assault force. Not this level of devastation created by a single exhausted, wounded lieutenant who had refused to retreat. Boot prints, shell casings, and blood trails told the story more clearly than any words ever could. Close combat. Grenades thrown from point-blank range. rifle shots fired with deadly precision. Signs of hand-to-hand struggle where bayonet marks scarred the ground. Every detail showed the same truth. He had fought everywhere. He held the entire ridge alone, one Marine whispered, as if afraid to disturb the silence. Another knelt by the lieutenant and checked for a pulse. Relief washed over his face. He's alive. Barely, but he's alive. The team worked quickly, lifting him onto a stretcher. But before they carried him away, each one took a moment to look around the battlefield again. The rising sun illuminated everything, painting the ridge in a harsh, unforgiving glow. The jungle still smelled of smoke and cordite. The bodies cast long shadows, and the Marines realized something profound. They had expected to find nothing but defeat when they returned. Instead, they found a victory created by one man's refusal to abandon his post. As they began descending the ridge, the lieutenant stirred faintly. His eyes opened just enough to see the brightening sky. Did we hold it?" he asked, voice barely a whisper. One of the Marines squeezed his shoulder. "We didn't," he said. "You did." And with the sun climbing higher, revealing the battlefield in full, they carried him away, not just as a wounded officer, but as the man who had turned a hopeless night into a story that would be told long after the war was over. When the dust finally settled and the ridge quieted, the Marines who returned to the battlefield understood that what had happened the previous night was more than just a desperate stand. It was the kind of moment that reshapes an entire campaign. One man's courage altering the course of a battle that should have been lost before it even began. News of the lieutenant's stand traveled fast. By the time he was carried to the field hospital, officers and scouts had already pieced together what he had done. The Japanese assault force had been preparing to push past the ridge and strike deep into the American line. That breakthrough would have split the Marines, isolated entire companies, and opened a path straight toward the supply dumps. If they had succeeded, the island could have been lost within days. But one lone defender had changed everything. Intelligence officers counted the number of enemy bodies found across the ridge, the shattered equipment, the abandoned rifles, and the trail of blood leading back into the jungle. Their conclusion was simple. The Japanese attack had collapsed because they believed they had run into a full American platoon dug in and ready to fight. Instead, they had run into a lieutenant who refused to give up an inch of ground, firing, maneuvering, and shouting commands into the dark to make the enemy think he was never alone. Word spread through the division like wildfire. Marines talked about him around cook fires in foxholes and while cleaning their rifles. To them, he became a symbol, reminding every man that even in the bleakest hour, one Marine could hold back the darkness long enough for others to fight another day. But the legacy he left behind went deeper than morale. When the next Japanese offensive came, the American line held firm. The officers who planned the defense took the lieutenant's stand as proof that the ridge was critical ground, and they reinforced it heavily. Machine gun teams, mortars, and riflemen were positioned exactly where he had fought alone the night before. When the enemy returned, expecting to finish what they had started, they ran into a fortified wall of steel. The ridge never fell again. Weeks later, when the campaign shifted and the Marines pushed forward, the lieutenant, now recovered enough to walk with help, returned to see the place where everything had happened. The jungle had grown back slightly, but the scars were still there. Splintered trees, bullet holes carved into rocks, and the faint outline of foxholes he had dug in the darkness. He stood quietly, saying nothing. The men around him didn't speak either. When the dust finally settled and the ridge quieted, the Marines who returned to the battlefield understood that what had happened the previous night was more than just a desperate stand. It was the kind of moment that reshapes an entire campaign. One man's courage altering the course of a battle that should have been lost before it even began. News of the lieutenant's stand traveled fast. By the time he was carried to the field hospital, officers and scouts had already pieced together what he had done. The Japanese assault force had been preparing to push past the ridge and strike deep into the American line. That breakthrough would have split the Marines, isolated entire companies, and opened a path straight toward the supply dumps. If they had succeeded, the island could have been lost within days. But one lone defender had changed everything. Intelligence officers counted the number of enemy bodies found across the ridge, the shattered equipment,